On page 181 of American Born Chinese, author Jean Lewin Yang uses shifting placement and a variety of color shades throughout the panels to show that a person's sudden change in emotions and realizations of someone can unwillingly alter their perspective against themselves. By doing so, Jin is on the first step of how Buddhists deal with desire by being engulfed in his suffrage rather than accepting his suffering. Jin's positioning throughout the page always features him away from the spotlight, almost making it seem like he's a side character of his own story. In the first panel, Jin is in the center of it, which doesn't spark any abnormalities because he's the main character. However, his body is facing its side, looking back at Greg walking in the other direction. His slanted posture and his head facing slightly downwards shows how his emotions are becoming sadder and surrounded by confusion. On the second panel, Jin is seen to be placed farther from the screen and Amelia. Instead of Jin being the center focus, Amelia, who is seen happily talking to another girl about something, becomes the person who takes up the most space. Jin's body is still not facing forward, and his head is now facing more downward. On the third panel, Jin's placement has been reduced significantly, and doesn't even have his face shown in the panel anymore. Jin is seen there having lunch with Susie and Wei Chen, who just so happens to be laughing about something. In the last panel of the page, Jin is finally back to facing forward. He is placed on the side of the panel, surrounded by a classroom filled with people he clearly does not care for. Besides using placement to show Jin's emotions, the author also uses the shading of colors. The colors of the page are rather dark, filled with shadows, representing Jin's emotions at the moment. On the first panel, the difference in color between Jin and the background isn't different from each other, almost complementing the fictional atmosphere. Jin's color palette mixes seamlessly with the colors of the school and the sky, making it seem like there's nothing going on. However, in the second panel, it transitions to a shaded color palette, with the windows not even showing what's on the other side, and are instead filled with darkness. This scene is surrounded by dully colored accessories like the gray window blinds and the trash can. On the third panel, it goes back to a comic color palette, yet it still has some gray colors in there, like the tree being gray instead of green. The last panel strips colors entirely, leaving only the color in Jin's clothes to be shown. The students in the classroom are filled with no colors, and Jin is the only guy with actual colors. Despite being the only object with color, he still has a depressive expression on his face. The lighter colors of Jin outshine the darker colors of the classroom, making him the main character again. The placement of Jin shows how lonely and isolated he is from the world by being placed at a distance. Jin going from taking up an appropriate amount of space in the pages to looking like a background character shows how he feels lonely and sad because of Greg's impact. His face going from being visible to facing the other direction shows his depressive mood mixing with his feelings of confusion. Using the color changes throughout the page shows how his mood is constantly changing from feelings he isn't even aware of. The constant battle between keeping a lighter color palette and a darker color palette shows how Jin is unsure of his emotions, having to deal with this familiar feeling of not fitting in because of uncontrollable circumstances explains the splashes of darkened objects, such as the window in the second panel, the tree on the third panel, and the entirety of the classroom losing its identity on the fourth panel. These two elements together result in showing the isolation and the mood changes Jin is dealing with. The feeling of not knowing how to feel can lead to Jin's suffering as a person. In correlation to suffering, Jin is engaging with the first noble truth of Buddhist teachings, finding out about suffering. But what are the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism? The Four Noble Truths are like a step-by-step guide that involves the teachings of Buddhism when it comes to suffering. The first noble truth is finding out that suffrage is in a person's life. This is the stage where Jin is in because he is aware that something is wrong, just not what that something truly is. This continues to the next noble truth, the second. The second noble truth is about the cause of the suffering. Finding out what is causing the suffering to happen in the first place takes you to one step further into reaching nirvana. Jin is not at this point yet because he is still confused about his emotions and continues to dwell on his suffering. The third and fourth Noble Truths are accepting suffering and maintaining it. Although Jin is still on step 1 of the 4 Noble Truths, with time he will eventually be free from his confusing emotions, similar to being free from suffering. In conclusion, author Jin Lewin Yang uses the moving placement and a variety of color tones throughout the panels to show a person's sudden change in emotions and the realizations that someone can alter their thoughts against themselves. By doing so, Jin is on the first noble truth of Buddhism and will eventually be free from his suffering.